Alright, welcome to a new video, and this is a weird one. This popped up in my recommended list on YouTube just yesterday. Should New Zealand be the 51st state? The 51st state of what, you might be asking? Obviously the 51st state of the United States of America. Can't say that's a question I've ever really thought about before, which is of course why it got my attention in the first place, which is why I thought, let's watch this. Better still, let's watch this and see what other people think, especially what other New Zealanders think. But anyone for that matter. Americans too. I mean, what do you guys think? Should you have a 51st state? Should it be New Zealand? Now, a little bit of background. This is a video by a guy called Peter Boghossian. I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce his name. Let's just call him Peter. I've seen Peter a few times pop up on YouTube every now and then. He makes these videos where he goes around asking people quite controversial topics, and he just gets normal people on the street to have a controlled debate about them. Sometimes it's pretty interesting stuff. Anyway, let's get into this. Again, I won't be showing the whole video. I don't want to show someone's entire video. I do encourage you to go watch Peter's video in its entirety. But let's just look at a few choice highlights. See if we can get the gist of the argument.
Look, if we voted democratically and we joined the United States, look, I wouldn't stop it. I'd go, right, look, that's fair, high voter turnout, a majority of New Zealanders agree with this. Let's do it then.
So you wouldn't like be an insurgent or anything?
No, however,
Okay.
I would spend that entire referenda campaigning against it and saying this is a bad decision for Māori, for minorities in New Zealand, for anyone who's got healthcare issues.
Well, the minorities in New Zealand could be minorities in the U.S.
Well, then they'd be smaller minorities.
Right, is that bad?
That's a pretty valid point, I think. I mean, at the moment, the minorities, it doesn't matter if you're a minority in New Zealand right now. Minorities in New Zealand now will still be minorities if we did join the USA. Does that necessarily mean things will change for those minorities very much? I don't know. Just New Zealanders in general will be considered a minority group within the United States of America.
Getting drinks, and my work colleague said, can you go over there and ask them about that sign? So,
And the sign said, should New Zealand become the 51st U.S. state?
and I read it and I thought, that is a very bizarre question.
What do you think?
And I'm
should it?
thinking, no, I
Okay.
don't think I think we're a standalone country and we're quite happy how we are, and we do have a relationship with America.
Should New Zealand become the 51st American state?
No.
Are you American?
I
You're
am.
from the United States?
Yep. If people think things are bad here in New Zealand, it's worse in the States.
Absolutely not.
Why?
New Zealand's current system of governance and the progress we've made as a nation on the social front are really good and seen as the envy of the world. And I think being folded into the United States would completely sabotage that.
Seems like most people are fully against it so far. What the guy in the hat just said there about New Zealand being the envy of the world, I mean, I do think overall, New Zealand is a pretty good place to live. If there's one thing that does bug me a little bit though, it's coming from someone who has lived overseas in quite a few countries, is that we do tend to live in our own little bubble here in New Zealand, and we tend to think quite highly of ourselves. I'm not quite sure if we are really the envy of the world. Maybe in some things. You could certainly say the number of people that want to come and live here would be evidence to suggest that we are a pretty good place to live in and the envy of some people. What I found traveling around the world is that depends where you go, and values are not often shared around the world. Some of the things that we think here in New Zealand or in other Western countries are very desirable, virtuous even. You may be surprised to find in other countries and societies that that's not the case. And even in some cases, they were considered the way we live or the things that we value not desirable at all. That's something that interests me from this video right away.
Well, the U.S. right now, it's going downhill. So
Okay.
If people think things are bad here in New Zealand, it's worse in the States.
What's going down?
That's an argument I heard a lot of around 2016 when Donald Trump won his first term in office. And it became a bit of a meme after that for a lot of Americans to say, oh, screw this, I'm moving to New Zealand.
Down in the U.S. now that people here should know about?
Well, the most recent presidential election,
Okay.
it seems Trump has won the popular vote and the electoral
Correct.
vote.
You're correct.
And it seems like the Republicans have control of the House and the Senate.
I believe that is correct as well.
Yep. And
Certainly for a lot of Americans like this woman here, New Zealand is kind of viewed as some sort of escape plan, some sort of haven. I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. We've got a lot of problems of our own here, and I don't know, if you think you've got problems in your country, why not stick around and try to fix them? But I digress. Let's carry on.
So what are your top 3 reasons for why New Zealand should not be the 51st state?
I think our current system of governance is really good.
Okay, that's one.
We have very little corruption. Well, you know,
That's 2.
Yeah. And 3, I think, we're so far away, it's like, what's even the point of having another state on the other side of the world?
Yeah, Guy in the Hat actually raises some good points. I mean, we are miles and miles away from the mainland continental USA. I don't know how people in Hawaii feel about the distance issues. It would be even further if New Zealand was a state of the USA and you wanted to travel, air quotes, domestically to New Zealand. I think that distance would still allow us to keep a lot of our identity and culture, really. Also, he mentioned our system of government, which he thinks is pretty good. Yeah, and I think it's mostly pretty good. There are areas which can be improved on, I suppose. When I think about the US political system, I do think it's a bit strange that there's basically only 2 parties you can choose from. Choice is a good thing, and every time we vote in New Zealand, we do have a lot of options we can choose from. That does lead to a little bit of chaos, though, in forming a government, which we have a style of government in New Zealand which is designed towards creating coalition governments, really. I think since we adopted that system about 30 years ago, we've only had one majority government. That was the Labour Party government about 4 years ago, led by Jacinda Ardern, but that's been the exception. It's coalition governments every time. Let's see what this guy has to say.
Foremost, we're a day ahead of America. Right now, America.
You're in the future.
We're in the future, effective, time zone wise at least. So the time zones kind of don't match up and make it a bit hard to do business and politics and all that kind of stuff.
On a scale from 1 to 10, how strongly do you feel that New Zealand should not be a 51st state? On a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being not strong at all, and 10 being I'm absolutely positive it should not. Where are you?
10.
You're really a 10.
I'm really a 10.
And your first reason for that is the time zone? I have to tell you, of all the reasons, I'm just being very blunt with you, of all the reasons that I've heard for New Zealand to not be a 51st state, that's a pretty weak one.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Peter here. We're already doing business with the USA. In this day and age, the internet just makes doing business globally so easy. I don't really see that being a massive barrier.
No, I don't think we should become the 51st
Why?
state. So why would you say we should be?
Well, a lot of reasons, actually. One is you could get to come to the United States for indefinite
Okay, so these are the
period of
benefits,
time.
right? These are the benefits.
Yeah, well, you said why I'll tell you why.
Yeah,
why
yeah,
I
no,
think we
yeah.
should
Okay, cool. Yeah.
become-
Okay, so you got
okay.
my attention, and I think
Okay, so
I think our man with the gin and tonic in his hand is just a wee bit drunk. Knowing this exact location where they're standing, they're right outside a bar where you can drink outside on the lawn outside the bar. Interesting that he would opt to talk to a man who appears to be a little bit lit.
So you can then, if you want to leave the island, you have a much, 5 million people here versus.
so. You're saying it would be a
2,
sweeter
3.
deal than, say, New Zealanders travelling to the UK, to England. You know how
well,
we have
you'd
our.
be citizens.
Yes. Right. Okay.
You'd be a state. You'd literally be citizens. You'd be entitled to vote. You'd be entitled to representation. You'd be entitled to everything. You think Donald Trump would be good for New Zealand?
No.
No.
Sorry for my
no.
swearing, but
You don't
not
think
at
so?
all.
Oh, the Trump question. This will be interesting.
Why? Why not?
Well, look, I'll say Project 2025, but I also know that some people are still unsure as to whether that is his plan.
If Harris got in, would you think it's a good thing that New Zealand became the 51st state?
Not necessarily. I think New Zealand should remain, regardless of whoever's president. The political climate in the States and New Zealand is still different. And also, you have to consider the physical distance.
Look, if we voted democratically and we joined the United States,
Yeah.
look, I wouldn't stop it. I'd go, right, look, that's fair, high voter turnout, a majority of New Zealanders agree with this, let's do it then.
So you wouldn't like be an insurgent or anything?
No, however,
Okay.
I would spend that entire referenda campaigning against it and saying this is a bad decision for Maori, for minorities in New Zealand, for anyone who's got healthcare issues.
Well, the minorities in New Zealand could be minorities in the U.S.
Well, then they'd be small minorities.
Right, is that bad?
Well, in a majoritarian democracy, the smaller your minority is, the less people are going to care about your minority because they don't need your vote.
Yeah, he's got a point. I said at the start of this, I've never really heard this case for should New Zealand be the 51st state of the USA. I've occasionally come across the argument that New Zealand should become a state of Australia. I've highlighted in previous videos before about the history of New Zealand that New Zealand was invited to join the Federation of Australia back when the idea of forming an Australian nation was being proposed. That option for New Zealand to join still exists in the Australian Constitution, by the way. And one of the big topics or reasons why New Zealand didn't join that in the first place is because there was already a deal, the Treaty of Waitangi, sort of for any non-New Zealanders watching this, it's kind of a contract between the British Crown and the Maori tribes of New Zealand who signed that treaty. So that made joining Australia quite a difficult prospect. You'd have to draw up a new contract, a new deal between the indigenous tribes of New Zealand. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of New Zealanders are not into the idea of New Zealand becoming a republic, because it's quite problematic when it comes to the Treaty of Waitangi. Maybe we'd have to draw up an entirely new treaty, which would be a massive headache. So a lot of people just say, stick with the status quo. And I imagine it would be the same if New Zealand was asked to join the United States of America.
Yes.
Are you ready as a taxpayer to have your taxes significantly increased to pay for your own defense? Because that's what Donald Trump has assured you is coming.
Yeah, I mean, we just came out of an election where the government just promised tax cuts and they won. So it seems like, no, we're not prepared to spend a whole lot more money on anything.
And that wouldn't be sufficient to change your mind about becoming 51st state?
I mean, we're at the bottom of the world. It seems like the most damage people could do to us is cutting us off, not actually invading us or anything. So
you're fine with not defending yourselves and then not becoming a U.S. state?
Well, defending ourselves against what?
Well, you only have 10 ships in the Navy, right?
Yeah, I think 10 after the 11th one sunk.
Yeah. And it sunk in peacetime underground, right?
Yeah.
So maybe there are some issues there you want to think about.
That's funny. Yeah, we did lose one of our few naval vessels in peacetime quite recently. Kind of embarrassing, I suppose. Yeah, the old defense argument. I suppose one of the benefits of joining the United States of America would be that being American territory mean we would have full protection of the United States military. I imagine there would be bases installed here. And I'm no expert on New Zealand's defense policy by any means at all. I have heard stories every now and then that we really don't spend a lot of money on defense because, like this guy in the hat here argues, who's going to come down here? And for the large part, I think that's true. I guess, though, if stuff did hit the fan and there was a major global conflict, we're pretty vulnerable and we do tend to rely on others to protect us. We probably rely mostly on Australia. Any sort of conflict that would happen, our forces are quite small, but they would be supporting Australia in any sort of defensive maneuvers. So yeah, if we did join the USA, we wouldn't really have to worry about that. We would just come under the umbrella of the United States military.
Okay, I hear you.
Okay.
Is there more than two reasons?
May I give you more?
Go on then. How many you got?
Why don't I just give you 3 and stop at that?
3. We'll stop at 3 and then we'll move the conversation along to something else.
You'd have our first.
I don't think our drunk guy here has really thought about this issue terribly deeply. I mean, how would you when you're a few drinks in? And he seems to have the attitude, he seems to have that sort of drunken bravado attitude of, I'm right and this guy's an idiot. I'm going to see if I can really show him up. As far as I know, Peter here is a bit of a respected figure in these sorts of circles. I'm not sure about Gin and Tonic Man on the left here.
First Amendment.
Which is, sorry?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech, yeah. We already have that, right?
No, not a constitutionally protected guarantee. You'd have a constitutionally protected guarantee of free
The
speech.
court of law.
Nobody can interfere with that.
So that's 3.
Oh yeah, the freedom of speech argument. Not being a legal expert or a lawyer of any sorts, let's look up New Zealand's freedom of speech laws. And according to Google's AI overview, New Zealand's freedom of speech is protected by the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, Guarantees the right to freedom of expression, which includes the right to share, receive, and seek information and opinions. Okay. Limits of freedom of speech. Okay, that's interesting. We have limits on this. Freedom of speech is not absolute and can be limited when it conflicts with other rights. Speech that is intended to excite hostility can be a criminal offense. Interesting. Freedom of speech can be limited in cases of libel, slander, obscenity, pornography, fighting words, and intellectual property. I know the Labour Party in New Zealand here, especially when they were in government, they were trying to introduce a bill into law, a law that would limit free speech in New Zealand. They were trying to introduce hate speech laws into New Zealand. And that debate is still ongoing here. Free speech advocates saying that free speech is free speech. It doesn't matter what it is. You might disagree with it entirely, but people still have the right to say what they want. Unless, of course, it's going to immediately incite some sort of violence towards an individual or people's property, that sort of thing. I guess that's one thing that the United States famously has. It's enshrined in the Constitution, the right to absolute freedom of speech. So it doesn't matter if you're completely upset or totally offended by something that another person says, you're allowed to say that. Doesn't mean your speech comes without consequence at all, but at the very least, you're not going to get into any legal trouble whatsoever for the words that you say. So I know we're debating that a lot in New Zealand lately, and things like hate speech laws, I know it has become a thing in places like the UK. The last few years in the UK is something like, I don't know whether it's completely true or not, but I've heard stories of like 3,000 people arrested each year for what they say online. That does sound pretty crazy. So it's an interesting argument here when he mentions free speech.
All right, I got something for you.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to change your mind if the United States gave you a guarantee that 5 years after you voted in to be the 51st state, all taxes across the board, sales and income tax, would be halved?
No.
Really?
Wait, what? That's not a bad deal. What, half of your income taxes and state taxes just cut? I would at least think about this if that was a proposal. What did he say? 5 years after we joined the USA, income and state taxes would be cut in half.
Yeah, we should raise the taxes on the wealthy, mate. That's the problem at the moment.
Interesting. He's saying we need more taxes. And yeah, given that someone else in this video just mentioned that we voted in a new government, well, it's not that new now, just over a year ago, where one of the big promises was an immediate tax cut that seemed to get them in. I'm not so sure if other New Zealanders would share his opinion. I'm at least open to the idea. If they're going to start saying things like, we're going to cut taxes in half. Half is a lot.
The other benefit is that you don't need to learn a new language.
So I can go to the UK and not have to learn a new language.
Correct, but you wouldn't be a citizen.
And there's a lot more history from a human who's more exploratory would tend to, I'm torn between the states.
You're torn, you're drunk.
And going to the UK,
Their
but I think I'm gonna go to the UK.
Their economy isn't as good.
Who
Our
told you
economy
that?
is far better. Well, especially now that Trump got in.
I would say I'm leaning more towards, I like your idea.
Wow, so maybe it's because he's had a few, but he's coming around to the idea of New Zealand becoming the 51st state of the USA. Look, I think as far as the video goes, we'll leave it there because I do encourage people to go and watch the video in its entirety. I wonder what the comments say. I wonder how many people have commented on this from New Zealand, the USA, or elsewhere, really. What did it say in the description? Gave me great happiness to see Reid and Travis standing on a crowded corner in Auckland, New Zealand, holding the sign, New Zealand should be the... Well, it's clearly Wellington here. Very, very clearly Wellington. You can tell that, well, just by the fact that it's Wellington waterfront, and no less because of the wind that's constantly blowing while he's interviewing people. Wellington has a completely different mentality to the rest of New Zealand, and you can tell from the topics they touch on. I mean, he's got a point. Wellington is famously very left-leaning. It would be interesting to see what people think in other parts of New Zealand. Like, for example, if he went somewhere... I mean, that's the thing. The problem is New Zealand doesn't have very many big cities, so it's not easy to do this kind of thing. I mean, realistically, you've only got Auckland, Wellington, perhaps Christchurch. I'd be interested to see what people in Christchurch think of this. But yeah, if he could travel round to more regional centres of New Zealand and see what people think about this topic, could be quite interesting. Might be a little bit different to what people think in Wellington. Surprised no one mentioned New Zealand's stance on nuclear, becoming an enemy of US enemies. Well, I think we already lean towards the US anyway on many, if not most things. Economically, we're very much tied up with the USA. I don't really see us being very close to the BRIC countries. That's what Brazil, Russia, India, China. Although we trade a lot with India and China, but politically, let's just say some of the views of some of those countries are a little bit problematic. I think it's fair to say if the geopolitical situation got really bad and it led to another world war, we've been military allies of the USA before, and I don't see that really changing ever. If this was Australia, the question would be, so what's it like already being the 51st state? If New Zealand joined America, it would be a huge pain in the ass for America to have to convert to decimal drive on the left. Hey, that's the point. Would they make us drive on the other side of the road? Would we have to switch to feet and inches, miles per hour, that sort of thing? Stop tipping and... Oh, yeah, tipping culture. That's something we don't have here in New Zealand. I mean, minimum wage here is, I can't remember, like $25, $26, New Zealand dollars that is, which is about $12 to $13 US. I understand serving jobs in the US are terribly paid and hence they rely on tips. It's nice that when you come back from a trip from the States, you come back here in New Zealand and you don't have to worry about tipping or, you know, servers getting really sort of antsy around you. Think, oh, is he going to leave a tip or not? I really don't like tipping culture. I mean, something they don't really touch on in this video is New Zealand's identity. Really, if we become part of another country, what happens to our identity? Obviously, the nation of New Zealand ceases to exist then. I mean, what happens to our sports teams? What happens to the All Blacks? Those are the real questions. Then there's language. I mean, obviously, we all speak English, although people on either side of the debate would argue about whether or not it's correct English that either of us speak. Would we be gradually invaded by people from the mainland USA coming to move over here and like changing us culturally, changing the way we speak? Would we all speak with American accents after a decade or so? Or would a lot more Americans try to speak with a New Zealand accent? And can they get it right? Famously, Americans not very good at doing other English accents at all. If you want to watch a video about that, I've got a whole video about it right here, actually.